Good evening, everyone. So we're going to have a look this evening at a chap called Josephus and why he's relevant to the Gospel accounts. So as we've considered over the last 4 weeks, the Gospels by themselves, interwoven into a compelling narrative, provide a reliable source of information about the Lord Jesus Christ. And these Gospel accounts, as we have been aware from some of our previous talks, have been relentlessly challenged and analysed. Yet these 4 Gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, have withstood the criticism from every corner. And so the Christian can rest his or her faith on this strong foundational evidence. And criticism of the Gospels is not something to be shied away from, but actually it's to be welcomed. We want people to criticise the Gospels because we want to base a message, our faith, on truth and not on something that's false. So we're happy for the Gospels to be criticised. But much like the commander of a castle might seek to shore up the defences, perhaps adding a buttress or a defensive tower, it's possible also for the Christian to go further in a quest for truth than just the reliability of the Gospel accounts themselves. It's possible for the Christian to find more reasons to be confident in the Gospel message of the Scriptures. And so, we would propose that when we have internal evidence and internal harmonies, some of those things that we've looked at this month, plus we add to that external evidences, then this makes a compelling case for belief. And I'm sure we can all appreciate the value of having evidences for the things that happen in the Scriptures which reside apart from the Scriptures themselves. So we've built up an understanding of these Gospel accounts, and we know, of course, that their main narrative is concerning the Lord Jesus Christ and his life. But we can also establish some external evidences for the historical existence of Jesus from outside of these Gospel accounts. And if you remember, we looked at some of these when we were looking at the historical reliability of the Gospels. I think that was a couple of months ago now. We might remember we looked at a chap called Tacitus, who was a Roman historian and who wrote in his Annals of Roman History about Jesus. We read there in his 15th book and chapter 44, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So Tacitus here is writing about the great fire which took place at Rome and describing how Nero made Christians in Rome a scapegoat. And this is one of the reasons why Christians are actually eventually expelled from Rome, a fact noted by Acts when we read of Aquila and Priscilla, who had been ejected. So we see here that Tacitus reports that Christians derived their name from a historical person called Christus. It's the Latin, or as the term that we're more familiar with is, of course, Christ. He's said to have suffered this most extreme penalty, alluding to the Roman method of execution known as crucifixion. And this is said to have occurred during the reign of Tiberius and by the sentence of Pontius Pilate. And again, this confirms much of what the Gospel tells us about the death of the Lord Jesus. Another example that we looked at was this chap here called Pliny the Younger. And he also provides some external evidence for the historicity of Jesus. And he writes in a letter to Emperor Trajan in 112 AD about these Christians. Pliny was the Roman governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, and in one of his letters he asked Trajan's advice about the appropriate way to conduct legal proceedings against those accused of being Christians. And Pliny says he needed to consult the emperor about this issue because a great multitude of every age, class and sex stood accused of being Christians. And so at one point in his letter he relates some of the information that he's learned about these Christians here, and we can see that on the screen now. So again, it's important to note that this provides external evidence for the existence of this group of followers of Christ, and we can see some of their customs that Pliny had come across. But perhaps the most remarkable reference to Jesus outside the Bible can be found in the writings of Josephus, who we're going to have a look at. And on 2 occasions he mentions Jesus. The second, less revealing reference describes the condemnation of one James by the Jewish Sanhedrin. And this James, says Josephus, was the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. And we can read about that here, how before the Sanhedrin was brought the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James and some others. And then they were eventually stoned. So again, we have here another external piece of contemporary evidence for the historicity, the existence of Jesus. But as interesting as this brief reference is, there is an earlier one, which is a lot more detailed. And this reference has become so famous, or perhaps infamous in some quarters, that it's now received its own name. And this reference is called the Testimonium Flavianum. And we read there, again, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to a cross, those who had at first come to love him did not cease. He appealed to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has to this day not disappeared. So this is really the most famous of Josephus' writings, and we can see, of course, how it clearly has something to say about Jesus. And we'll come on to this a little bit later. So my proposal for this talk is to cover the following. So, who was Josephus? What were the works that he produced? How does Josephus interface with the Bible? What does Josephus say about Jesus, and what are some of the comments about that statement, as we've seen already? We can have a look at some of the criticism of Josephus, and is it fair? And lastly, we'll draw some conclusions. So we have here a couple of depictions of Josephus. On the left here is a engraving, a romanticised engraving, we should say, because we can see that it's got some elements from the period in which it was done. And this appears in William Whiston's 18th century translation of Josephus's works. And on the right-hand side is a bust said to be of Josephus dated to the 1st century, so it's contemporary to the time that Josephus lived. And this is actually, you can find this in the Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen in Denmark. And this is said to be of Josephus. Josephus, we know a little bit about his life because, helpfully for us, he wrote an autobiography. So we know that Josephus was born into one of Jerusalem's elite families. And Josephus introduces himself as the son of Matthias, who was a Jewish priest. Now, he was the second-born son of Matthias. His older brother was also called Matthias. Their mother was an aristocrat, a woman who descended from the royal Hasmonean dynasty. And some more of his direct ancestors was a chap by the name of Simon Pacellus, who was a contemporary of John Hyrcanus, who was one of the Maccabees. Josephus' family was very wealthy, and he had descended through his father into the priestly order of the Jehoiarib, which was the first of the 24 orders of priests in the temple in Jerusalem. Josephus was a descendant of the high priest Jonathan, and he was raised in Jerusalem and educated alongside his brother. So Josephus was definitely an aristocrat, one of the upper classes. And when he was about 14, the high priests and principal men of the city, he writes, came frequently to me to find out my opinion on some points in the Jewish law. So Josephus certainly had a high opinion of himself. And at the age of 16, he writes that he started investigating the views of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And he did all this in a few weeks, apparently, a few short months. Then he says that he was told about this chap called Bannus, who lived in the desert, who used no clothes except what grew on trees, ate no food except what grew on its own accord, and bathed frequently night and day in cold water to preserve his chastity. Josephus records how he imitated him and continued with this chap called Bannus in the desert for 3 years. Then eventually he returned to the city, and it was at this point that he began to conduct himself according to the rules of the Pharisees. And it was to this group that Josephus would strongly align himself. And in AD 64, Josephus went to Rome. He was sent there by the rulers of the Jews at the time to negotiate the release of several priests who had been taken hostage by the Emperor Nero. And of course he went by boat, as would have been the quicker way from the province of Judea to Rome. And he recounts how it was an adventurous voyage, which included a shipwreck. And he writes that our ship sank in the Adriatic Sea, and there were about 600 people on board, and we swam for our lives all night. And at dawn we sighted a ship of Cyrene, and by God's providence 80 of us were rescued. And like Paul, the Apostle Paul, who was also shipwrecked, Josephus landed at Puteoli near Naples. And in Italy, he became familiarised with a Jewish actor who was much beloved by Nero. And it was through this actor that he met Poppaea, who was Nero's wife. And Josephus managed to strike up some sort of relationship with the emperor's wife, and eventually it was possible to ask her to get these priests released. And Josephus writes how he not only succeeded therefore in his mission, but apparently she also gave him many presents before he returned home. When Josephus returned to Judea, however, he discovered that the political situation had changed. The nationalists, who were bent on winning independence, had won over large numbers of his contemporaries. And these nationalists, these zealots, wanted to overthrow the Roman rule and the Roman taxation and bring back the kingdom of the Jews. And Josephus recounts how he spoke out boldly in hope of changing their minds. I laid before their eyes against whom they were proposing to fight, and told them frankly that they were inferior to the Romans. And in the strongest terms he warned them that it would be crazy to rebel against their Roman masters. It would only lead to total disaster. But Josephus relents that he was unable to persuade them. And at this time, there was no Roman governor in office. And these zealots had already conquered the fortress of Antonia, seen on the screen here, which were the Roman army headquarters alongside the temple in Jerusalem. Shortly after this, the Great Revolt began in 66 AD. And this originated because of Roman and Jewish ethnic and religious tensions. And the crisis escalated due to anti-taxation protests and attacks upon Roman citizens. And the newly appointed Roman governor, a chap by the name of Gessius Florus, responded to these protests by the Jews against this heavy tax burden that they were having to pay by plundering the Jewish temple, claiming that the money was for the emperor, and the next day launching a raid on the city, arresting numerous senior Jewish figures. And this arrest prompted a wider, large-scale rebellion, and the Roman military garrison of Judea was quickly overrun by the rebels, while the pro-Roman king Herod Agrippa, together with Roman officials, had to flee Jerusalem. And so, as a result of this rebellion against Roman rule, the legate of Syria, who was in charge of the entire local region, was commanded to restore order and quell this revolt. And so the Syrian legion was brought down south into Judea, but was actually defeated by Jewish rebels at the Battle of Beth Horon, with 6,000 Romans massacred, and the legion's Aquila, which is the standard of the Roman legion, was lost. And back in Jerusalem, the Judean Free Government was formed, including the former high priest Ananus ben Ananus, Joseph ben Gurion, and Joshua ben Gamla, and these were elected as leaders. And Josephus managed to be appointed as the rebel commander in Galilee, and Eleazar was appointed as the rebel commander in Edom. But Josephus was not the only military leader in Galilee. We can see up the top there the portion of area that Josephus was responsible for. But there was also another military leader in Galilee, a man named John of Giscala, and he had organised a private militia of peasants. And the two commanders lost much time quarrelling with each other. And we can imagine that there were great social differences between the two armies. One was headed up by a Jewish aristocrat and the other headed up a group of peasants. So we can understand how there might have been quarrelling between them. And as a result, they failed to seize the strategically important city of Sepphoris, which was the first aim of the Roman offensive. Meanwhile, the Syrian legion, as I've mentioned, had already been defeated, so the Emperor Nero, worried about this rebellion in the province of Judea, appointed Vespasian, who was a warrior of wide experience in Germany and here in this country, in England, to be the Roman commander. And Titus, who was Vespasian's son, slightly younger than Josephus, but they were about the same age actually, came with the world-famous 5th, 10th and 15th legions, 3 whole legions brought down to quell this Jewish uprising. And soon Josephus recounts that there was an orgy of fire and bloodshed throughout Galilee. And Josephus managed to send a final letter to Jerusalem, setting out his assessment of the hopeless situation, and he writes, "When raw levies are confronted by veteran troops, infantry by cavalry, undisciplined individuals by seasoned regulars, men with nondescript weapons by fully armed legionaries, the issue can never be in doubt." So the Roman forces advanced into Galilee, and Josephus's group, seeing the might and the power of these Roman legions, fled and eventually regrouped at this place here, which we can see this small hilltop location of a town called Jotapata, or Yodfat, I think it's now called. And so this is one of the tells or mounds that they've excavated, and we can still see here some of the remains of fortifications on the top of it. And so, surrounded by the Roman legions, the Jews defended themselves with much resourcefulness, but gradually were worn down by the constant fighting, lack of sleep and shortage of water, and many casualties were taken. And just before dawn on the 47th night of the siege, the Romans surged in and there was a massacre. And the Romans were, of course, anxious to get hold of Josephus, being the military commander in the north. But he, as he recollects in his autobiography, jumped into a deep pit with a cave at the bottom, where he found 40 important people and plenty of supplies. And at night, Josephus retells how he climbed up out of this pit to see if escape was possible, but there were sentries all around. And a prisoner was eventually forced to betray him in the location of this pit. And Vespasian wanted to take him alive and offered him safe conduct and tried to persuade him to come out. And Josephus was prepared to give in, but the other men, those other 40 men inside, were adamant, determined to commit mass suicide rather than surrender. And in despair, Josephus yielded to what they said, proposing that they draw lots to kill one another in turn. And presumably it was Josephus who supervised or manipulated the process, for in the end only he and one other remained alive, and the two of them agreed to surrender. And watched a whole video on the mathematics of this, actually, and it's called the Josephus problem. And while this might not have been how it was, you can basically work out, if you're in a circle with X amount of people, you can always work out where to sit. So if everybody is killing everybody else and killing the person on their right hand, for example, so person number 1 kills number 2, then person number 3 kills number 4, and so on, the circle gets smaller and smaller, you can always work out where to sit, so you're one of the last people alive. I think in a group of 41, I think you sit in the 19th seat, and you'll be all right. So we can have a look at this if we're interested in the mathematics of this. So after agreeing to surrender, Josephus and this other chap were dragged before Vespasian, and many of Vespasian's advisors demanded that he be put to death at once. But Titus persuaded his father to spare him and to send Josephus to Nero. And hearing this, Josephus boldly asked if he might speak to Vespasian privately. And then all the aides-de-camps were ordered to withdraw except his son Titus. And Josephus said to Vespasian, "O Vespasian," and this was his way to save his skin, although you suppose you have taken captive or forsaken Josephus, I have come as a messenger of great tidings. Had I not been sent by God to you, I know the law of the Jews and how fitting it is for generals to die. Do you send me to Nero? For what? Will any successors of Nero endure until you? You are to be Caesar, O Vespasian, an emperor, you and this your son. Bind me now still more securely and keep me for yourself. For thou, O Caesar, art not only lord over me, but over the land and the sea and all the human race, and certainly I deserve to be punished by closer custody than now, if I fabricate anything concerning God." And so we can see how Josephus appealed to the ego of Vespasian and of his son, and ultimately that's what managed to keep him alive. And Josephus also refers to Vespasian as a messiah of sorts. Shortly after this, in AD 67, the news came to the province of Judea that Nero had met his end. And as a result, Vespasian paused the final assault on Jerusalem as he waited to see who would come into power. And in AD 69, 3 emperors came and fell. And shortly after this, the soldiers in Caesarea declared Vespasian emperor and called on him to save the empire in such a dangerous crisis. But Vespasian was not inclined to accept, preferring, as Josephus records, the security of private life. But when they heard this, his officers and men crowded round him with drawn swords, threatening to kill him if he refused. And sensing the widespread demand for strong leadership and conscious of his own ability, Vespasian gave in, and the campaign to sweep him to power in Rome rapidly gained strength. And shortly after this, Vespasian and Titus went down to Egypt to ensure that the loyalty of Egypt, the granary of the empire, could be counted on, and he and Titus spent some time at Alexandria. And it was here that Josephus was set free. After this, Vespasian sailed back to Rome, and Titus, who took over the campaign against the Jewish rebellion, took Josephus onto his staff and returned with him to Jerusalem. And what transpired upon the return to Jerusalem, as depicted in this famous painting, was detailed heavily by Josephus. And he writes that by the time that he returned, famine had become as great a menace to the Jews as the Roman army surrounding them. All human feelings, Josephus writes, alas, yield to hunger, and when hunger reigns, restraint is abandoned. And murder, torture, and cannibalism, Josephus reports, became common in the doomed city. Men crawled out in the night as far as the enemy guard posts, hoping to collect wild plants and herbs. And those who managed to get as far as neighbouring valleys in their desperate search for food were rounded up every day by cavalry and crucified in large numbers in full view of those manning the wall. And in their rage and bitterness, the soldiers nailed up their victims in various attitudes as a grim joke, till owing to the vast number, there was no room for the crosses and no crosses for the bodies. And Titus cut off the hands of many other prisoners and sent them back into the city in that state as a warning to the population. And in Josephus' opinion, he writes that we may sum it up by saying that no other city has ever endured such horrors. And eventually the city was stormed and the temple was set on fire. We read great flames, Josephus records, leapt up between the stones. And when all resistance had ceased, Titus put to death every elderly or infirm prisoner. Men in their prime who might be useful were herded into the temple area and shut up in the court of the women. And he picked out the tallest and handsomest youngsters to be kept for this triumphal procession in Rome. And those over 17 were sent to hard labour in Egypt or perished in the amphitheatres by the sword or wild beasts. And starvation, Josephus writes, disposed of about 11,000 just while the huge crowds were being sorted out. Josephus estimates that well over 1 million people lost their lives during the siege. The majority were Jews by race, but not citizens of Jerusalem, for they had come up together from the whole country for the Feast of Unleavened Bread and found themselves caught up in the disaster. And Josephus again writes that no destruction ever wrought by God or man approached the wholesale carnage of this war. And Josephus' writings on the destruction of Jerusalem and that campaign in the Judean province are important because only Josephus has recorded this story for us. No account of it by any Roman historian has survived. Plutarch, one of the famous Roman historians, ends his long series of biographies with the emperors killed in 69 AD, never refers to the War of the Jews. Neither does Pliny the Younger. Tacitus may have intended to touch on the subject, but his history of imperial Rome breaks off in AD 66. Only Suetonius contributes in any way to the history of the Roman conquest in Judea. And he makes a few brief allusions, telling us that Titus went to command one of his father's legions in Judea, and that in the final assault on Jerusalem, Titus's prowess inspired deep admiration in the troops. So we can see the scarcity of other writings on this. Not much detail at all. But of course, there is another source to which we can turn for allusion to that assault, and that's the Gospel accounts, and we've read that at our introduction. And these Gospel accounts record that 40 years earlier, as Jesus was going down to the Mount of Olives on what proved to be his final visit to Jerusalem, he saw the city spread out before him and wept over it, saying that if you had only known on this day what would bring peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. And they will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls. They will not leave one stone upon another. And returning to the Mount of Olives shortly afterwards, Jesus reiterates this warning. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles, and similar words are preserved in Luke and in Mark, which include the memorable declaration that those will be the days of distress unequalled from the beginning, when God created the world, even till now, and never to be equalled again. And the contrast between these predictions of the great disaster and Josephus' appallingly detailed account of their fulfillment are important. Yet in saying that no destruction ever wrought by God or man approached the wholesale carnage of this war, Josephus echoes what Jesus had prophesied. After the destruction of the city in 70 AD, Josephus accompanied Titus to Rome, where Josephus remained for the rest of his life. And Vespasian made him a Roman citizen, let him stay in what had formerly been his own house, gave him a pension and a large amount of tax-free land in Judea, generous, and this led to Josephus adopting the emperor's family name, becoming Flavius Josephus. And he was only 33 years old at this point, but his active life was over. And Josephus would have witnessed the building of the Arch of Titus in Rome, which we can still see today, and we know from the interior the record of the carving of the Jewish possessions being taken away by the Roman soldiers out of the temple. Josephus made remarkably good use of this forced retirement, becoming a somewhat prolific writer. First, he composed in Aramaic a history of the whole war, having, as he said, been an actor myself in many of its transactions and an eyewitness of most of the rest. In this book on the Jewish war, he sent to the Jews living in Arabia and beyond the Euphrates to Parthia and Babylon. Then Josephus took the trouble to learn Greek and employed secretaries to assist him in translating this book into this Greek language, which was universally used throughout the Roman Empire. Nothing escaped my knowledge, he insists. During the siege of Jerusalem, I saw and carefully wrote down what took place in the Roman camp, and I know all that the deserters told us about conditions in the city, for I was the only one who understood their language. I was so confident that I had recorded the facts truthfully, he says, that I first presented the books to Vespasian and Titus, then to many Romans who had taken part in the war, as well as to Jews living in Rome. And Titus even affixed his own signature to the volumes that Josephus wrote and gave orders for their publication. In fact, both Vespasian and Titus allowed him to access their memoirs, the records they had made as the struggle proceeded. He also had the help of King Agrippa, the man who features, as we might remember, in Acts chapter 25 and 26, who had also taken refuge in Rome and was able to talk to Josephus about many matters that he would not otherwise have known. So perhaps we can say that few historians in any age can have enjoyed such a rare combination of people accessible to them for presenting or trying to present a historical account of great public events. And the oldest manuscripts for the works of Josephus survived and date to the 10th and 11th centuries, But portions of his works are also quoted in earlier manuscripts by other authors, particularly Eusebius, who wrote in the 4th century, and there were also versions in other languages, a Latin translation made in about the 5th century. And these are all in codexes, that is bound books, not scrolls. So we can see the works he wrote there: an autobiography, The Life of Josephus, against Appian, which was defending the Jewish religion, the Antiquities of the Jews, which cover the entirety of Jewish history, I think even from the creation of the world. In there he talks about things like Abraham taught science to the Egyptians, who taught it to the Greeks, and also, of course, the wars of the Jews, which we've quoted from it extensively. We should, however, acknowledge that Josephus was not free from prejudice. It was impossible for a person in his situation to utter any criticism about the emperor upon whom he was totally dependent. And we remember that he received his patronage from Vespasian. And Josephus then, we read, writes scathingly about previous emperors and the wickedness of Roman governors such as Pontius Pilate, yet he only reports favourably on what Vespasian and Titus did. The Jewish leaders, however, could not expect such a favourable writing about them. And Josephus was totally opposed to the patriotic freedom fighters, the zealots, who were prepared to sacrifice their lives in the conviction that God would support them in fighting for independence from Rome. As a result of this, many critics have said that the Jewish wars is simply a piece of Roman propaganda. But we say that, again, that he was the only contemporary writer to detail at length the destruction of Jerusalem. It was at the end of his last book that he gives the fullest account of his religious convictions, his autobiography. And he says that God is the beginning, the middle and the end of all things, the governor of the universe. All men ought to follow him and worship him in the practice of virtue. Though known to us by his power, he is unknown to us in regard to his essence, but those who believe that God is inspector of their lives will not permit themselves to commit any sin. And the latest date mentioned by Josephus is 93 AD, when he was 56 years old, and we do not know how much longer he lived after that. So how does Josephus interface with the scriptures? Well, he provides contemporary evidence which is in agreement of the people, the customs, and the places of first century Judea. And he provides the context for the gospel narrative, particularly for the times before the gospel accounts and afterwards. And F.F. Bruce, a biblical historian, wrote that here in the pages of Josephus, we meet many figures who are well known to us from the New Testament. The colourful family of the Herods, the Roman emperors, Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius and Nero, Quirinius, the governor of Syria, Pilate, Felix and Festus, the procurators of Judea, the high priestly families, Annas, Caiaphas, Ananias and the rest, the Pharisees and Sadducees and so on. Against the background which Josephus provides, we can read the New Testament with greater understanding and interest. Now, this book here, which I'll detail at the end in the bibliography, which I think are some interesting books that we can read about. The writer here is very helpful in writing about some parallels to some of the New Testament passages. And so, for example, Josephus writes about some of the customs that we find in the New Testament. For example, this one here called Korban. Josephus provides some explanation about what he's talking about here. So read in Mark 17, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is Korban. That is a gift devoted to God. Well, what's Korban? The Gospels don't explain. They do say that. They say it's a gift devoted to God, and Josephus corroborates that. In Appian, he writes, the oath called Korban can only be found among the Jews. it declares what may be called a thing devoted to God. And also we read that Pilate stirred up further trouble by expending the sacred treasure known as Corban on an aqueduct 50 miles long, and this roused the population to fury. So again, this is a corroborative evidence for a small detail in the gospel accounts, but again, we would expect that small details in the gospel are still, of course, accurate. Josephus also writes about the Sanhedrin, which are referenced in the scriptures in Mark 14 and in the book of Acts 6 and 23. And Josephus writes also of the existence of the Sanhedrin at Jerusalem, and also importantly, he writes that our law has forbidden us to kill any man, however wicked, unless he has first been condemned to suffer death by the Sanhedrin. And we know that this custom was followed at the death of Jesus and also at the trial of and execution of Stephen. Josephus also writes about different people, one of whom is a chap called Quirinius, who's referenced in Luke. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And Josephus accounts how Quirinius was sent as censor into Judea, and that he was a Roman senator who had been consul of great dignity sent by Caesar into Syria. He came to Judea, which was part of Syria, to take account of its economy and to dispose of Archelaus's money. So again, this is corroborative evidence for the people, the customs and places that we find in the gospel accounts. We also have evidence from Josephus that provides us with some degree of knowledge that Josephus was writing accurately. We have this, for example. In the Judean desert, archaeologists discovered this ancient site at the location called Masada, and this is one example of the historical insight that Josephus delivers for us, testament to his ability as a historian.
Jewish patriots in the face of the Roman army in 73 CE. For nearly 2 years, the Jewish rebels successfully defied the power of Rome from atop this natural fortress. "1,300 feet above the Judean desert, etched by history and time, this rugged natural fortress was constructed by King Herod the Great as a palace complex to be a virtually impenetrable stronghold. It was able to store years' worth of food and supplies."
So this, some of us might have been here, and I know some of us have been here. This is the fortress at Masada. And this picture here shows what's now known to be, from the writings of Josephus, a ramp that was built by the Romans up to the top, and this was how they stormed this well-fortified fortress at Masada. But the point is that without the writings of Josephus, we'd have perhaps never really have known why this large ramp exists on the side of Masada and how that was particularly used by the Romans to assault the city. And this ramp is quite incredible, actually. It's thousands of tons of stone and earth that was put there mainly by Jewish slaves who were taken from Jerusalem, and Masada was actually the last fortress to fall in the Roman campaign. So that's one of the insights that Josephus provides us and helps us to assure ourselves of his accuracy as a historian. The other, perhaps, is another interesting case. On the right, we have an aerial photo of Herodium, which was a city that a chap called Herod built, and Josephus writes much about the family of the Herods. And the location of Herod's tomb is documented by Josephus, who says that the body was carried 200 furlongs to Herodium, where he had given order to be buried. And Professor Ehud Netzer, who was an archaeologist from the Hebrew University, read these writings of Josephus and focused his search on the vicinity of the pool and its surroundings as Josephus had described. And it was reported that Lower Herodium consisted or was found to have remains of a large palace, a racetrack, service quarters, and a monumental building whose function is still a mystery. Perhaps, said Ehud Netzer, who excavated the site, it's Herod's mausoleum. Next to it is a pool almost twice as large as modern-size Olympic pools. It took 35 years for Netzer to identify the exact location, but on May the 7th, 2007, an Israeli team of archaeologists, led by Netzer, announced that they had discovered the tomb, and the site is located at the exact location given by Josephus, atop tunnels and water pools at a flattened desert site halfway up the hill to Herodium, 12 kilometres south of Jerusalem. And the tomb contained a broken sarcophagus, but no remains of a body. So obviously, if archaeologists can use some of the writings of Josephus to identify some of those historical sites that he writes about, then we know that there is at least some degree of accuracy in the writings of this historian. But Josephus is not without criticism. And we can read here just one extract which summarises some of these criticisms. This historian writes that Josephus's accounts are marked with contradictions. For example, he gives contradicting accounts about his involvement in the war in Galilee. In one context, he claims he was sent to Galilee to lead the war against Rome, while in another he says that he and 2 other priests were sent to Galilee to promote peace with Rome. Other examples of his inconsistencies relate to his accounts about the destruction of the temple and the total number of troops he recruited in Galilee. Josephus claims that Titus had no desire to destroy the temple and that he even tried to save it, but he contradicts this account when he states elsewhere that Titus ordered the destruction of the temple. And in regard to the number of troops he recruited in Galilee, Josephus says that the total was 100,000 or 60,000, contrary to a total of 10,000 troops that he gives elsewhere in another of his writings. So we can see that there is estimation of Josephus that at times he exaggerates or makes some contradictions. And some of the other choice criticisms of Josephus are that he records that 115,880 corpses were removed at one of the gates during the invasion and assault on Jerusalem. Another item that he's criticised for is stating that the Galilean, the population in Galilee was about 3 million. And he's also criticised Josephus for attempting to blame the lower classes in Judea for the rebellion against Rome, while his fellow class, the aristocrats, go scot-free. But of course, anyone reading Josephus's works in order to construct historical events, like we are, must persistently keep in mind the person of the author and the point of view from which those events are described. And we know, of course, that Josephus would not have been without his biases, and perhaps sometimes he did dramatically exaggerate, but that does not discount the writings of Josephus as all a load of rubbish, as we've already shown some of the accuracy of some of his statements. So we'll come back then to this famous passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, and this is perhaps his most criticised piece of writing. And the opinions on the authenticity of this passage are varied. And one historian surveyed the books from 1937 to 1980 that were written about Josephus and noted that 4 scholars regarded this piece of writing here as genuine, 6 as mostly genuine, 20 accepted it with some insertions, 9 with several insertions, and 13 regard it as being totally disreputable. And the chief argument seems to be that it's highly unlikely that Josephus, who was a believing Jew, working under Romans would have written that Jesus was the Messiah. As we've already stated, Josephus, elsewhere in his writings, talks about Vespasian being the Messiah. So the criticism is that this would have made Josephus suspect of treason. And nowhere in any of his books is there an indication that Josephus himself was a Christian. And in Wars of the Jews, Josephus had declared that Vespasian had fulfilled the messianic prophecies. Furthermore, Origen, who was a Christian writer who wrote about a century before Eusebius in the 3rd century AD, says that Josephus did not believe in Jesus as the Christ. So the scholars say that the passage received some insertions. And so what the majority of scholars tend to do nowadays is to put these pieces which I've highlighted in red here and to call them insertions which were perhaps inserted a little later in history. So there is a consensus now that most scholars think that the core of this passage originated with the writings of Josephus, but that it was later altered by a Christian editor, perhaps between the 3rd and 4th century AD, because this passage remains in its entirety in a quote written by Eusebius in the 4th century. Again, Josephus was not a Christian, and so this seems to be the main contention, that it's difficult to believe that anyone but a Christian would have made some of these statements. For instance, the claim that Jesus was a wise man seems to be fairly neutral, fairly authentic, but the qualifying phrase, if indeed one ought to call him a man, is supposed to be suspect, implying that Jesus was more than human, and it's quite unlikely that perhaps that Josephus would have said this. But even if we disregard the questionable parts of this passage, we are still left with a good deal of corroborating information about the biblical Jesus. We read, if we take out those bits in red, that he was a wise man who performed surprising feats. And although he was crucified under Pilate, his followers continued their discipleship and became known as Christians. And when we combine these statements with Josephus' later reference to Jesus as the so-called Christ, we still find a detailed picture emerging from the writings of Josephus which harmonise well with the biblical gospel accounts. So we can say with Josephus' accounts here that the biblical Jesus and the historical Jesus appear to be one and the same. So, to summarise perhaps then the importance of Josephus regarding the scriptures, a historian wrote that it's indeed difficult to imagine how much we should have lost had the works of Josephus perished. Without him, the remarkable family of the Herods would be practically unknown. How Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus, despite his famous arch in Rome, would be a matter for conjecture. And with the exception of the story of the earlier Maccabees, the history of the Jews from the close of the Old Testament to the coming of Jesus would be a blank. He says no more, the New Testament itself would be filled with names and allusions to events to which the reader could have no possible clue. Further, even when a Jew attempts to relate what happened to his nation in the first centuries of the Christian era, the only contemporary literature available for his purpose is to be found in Josephus, the Gospels, and the Acts of the Apostles. Yet, strange to say, the Jews actually allowed all Josephus had written to fall in oblivion. This may in part be accounted for by the fact that this historian is conspicuously deficient in patriotism insofar as the national aspirations are concerned, despite his admiration for the law of Moses and his defence of the antiquity of the people of Israel. So in conclusion, we've covered that Josephus was a Jewish historian, commander and aristocrat who was personally involved in the first Jewish revolt and the subsequent Roman subjugation of Judea. that he wrote extensively about Jewish history and their religion, providing many corroborative examples to the gospel accounts, that he uniquely reports on the destruction of Jerusalem from a contemporary perspective, that he references Jesus, James and John the Baptist, and whilst one of these is challenged in particular, Josephus remains by common consensus to provide historical evidence for the existence of Jesus, his crucifixion, and the emergence of his followers as a group growing in presence. So, our faith is rooted in history. Not only does this give us confidence personally, but it also gives us credibility when we talk to others about it. And this is good news. So this is what Josephus can help us to corroborate from the gospel accounts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you indeed. We thank our speaker for the presentation.